Hello, Jamie. Are you there?
I am here.
Hmm.
I am making sure hopefully my dogs are settled. I just gave
Yeah, mine too.
Brutus a little piece of bread soaked in CBD oil.
Is Brutus named after character from Julius Caesar?
He is
Okay,
actually
yeah.
his AKC register's name is Et Brutus.
Et tu, Brutus. Why Brutus? The guy who stabbed Caesar.
But Brutus is an honorable man.
Okay.
I'm quoting Mark Antony.
Okay, yeah.
Um uh I think Brutus is complicated. No, so I truly believe that animals will tell you their names if you give them enough time. That's why my cat has a fancy name, but his real name is Little Shit. And Brutus, he was the quickest ever named. He was 8 weeks old. He was bigger than your average, Yorkshire Terrier puppy, but he was still really small. And I had this cat that was just huge. And Brutus walked in the house and jumped on the cat and started wrestling with the cat. And I was like, you little brute. And he turned around and he barked at me. And I was like, oh, is that your name, Brutus? And he jumped. And I was like, all right, cool.
All right, Brutus.
And
yeah.
that's what it is. That's what it is. So yeah. And he has many nicknames. As you know, dogs evolve nicknames over time. I had a Dalmatian once who started off as Yago and ended up as Bago Dog.
Bago Dog.
Yes. Yeah. So Brutus is, a lot of times he's Brew or Brew, but my niece called him Bruce. So Bruce, he's been Bruce for a long time too. When you're oh, poor Bruce, when he's having a bad day. And Brutalbus, I don't know where that one came from, but yeah, all the nicknames. And then my rescue, I did not have the naming of. But I think, well, I just say that Toby is short for Toblerone.
Toblerone.
All of the chocolate colors, so that works, huh? Toblerone. Just my boy. Are you a dog person?
Oh yeah, I got two. I got Stewie and Connor, and Stewie was his name when I got him from the shelter. So he responded to that. I didn't really change it because he already knew it. He was already 4 years old. And Connor, he's named after a character from a book I read as a kid that really made me sob my eyes out. But he's also, his full name's Connor O'Malley.
Connor O'Malley. What was the book, if you don't mind me asking?
It's called A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. It's about this boy who has this mother who's got cancer, and he's got this weird nightmare going on where there's this truth that he hasn't confronted, that he hasn't told himself. And there's this monster that it's made out of a yew tree, and it comes to life every night at 12:07 to come and tell him stories. Tells him 3 stories, and then the 4th story is supposed to be what Connor tells him. Oh. Hello?
Connor has to finish the stories.
Yeah.
Tell the 4th story.
Yeah, so that's that book.
Nice.
Hello.
Hello, Darius. How are you?
Yeah, my my Zoom decided it wanted to update.
It's always going to update.
Always when you least expect it to.
Yeah.
I hope you don't mind me sitting in, and my name is Jamie. I'm the programming director for Writespace, and I just want to thank you for joining us.
You, Jamie, I appreciate you joining us. My speakers are okay. All right.
Jamie, did you get the answer from Myra about which view would be best? Because I
did not get it. Did I get an answer? This is a good question.
Recommend probably speaker view.
Okay.
Maybe.
That's what it is in then, I believe. Okay. So anyway,
All right. Well, Darius, thank you for joining us. I guess I should start this interview by giving our viewers like just a brief overview of you and your accomplishments. So you're the author of The Ghost the Night Becomes, Intimacies and Borrowed Light, and the upcoming Be Not Afraid of My Body, a lyrical memoir. You earned an MFA in poetry from the Missioner Center for Writers at the University of Texas at Austin in 2021, and
Oh,
another MFA
2007.
2007. My bad. I read ahead. That's my bad. I lost time. And another MFA from the University of Iowa in 2020. Afterwards, in 2021, you were honored by the East Tennessee Hall of Fame with the inaugural Emerging Writer Award. And currently, you are a Lulu Merle Johnson Doctoral Fellow in English at the University of Iowa. That is quite a resume there. Yeah. How did it feel to get that East Tennessee Hall of Fame nomination? My God.
Well, I got the nomination and the award.
Yeah. I should say that.
Yeah, it was interesting. A former professor of mine at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where I got my bachelor's, emailed me, and he's very, straight to the point. He was just like, "What's your information? I want to nominate you for an award. It's no big deal, no monetary attached to that, but just whatever." And that was that. And then when I got the email saying I had been selected, I had forgotten all about it. I had, but I mean, I was very honored. I was actually familiar with the writers of literacy. I forget the name of it actually. It's something about literacy. But they sponsor the East Tennessee Writers Hall of Fame. And I served as a juror one year. So it was nice to be recognized as a recipient, this time around. So yeah, it was nice. I wish I had known you were going to mention. I would have.
I'm sorry.
It's a nice little,
yeah,
trophy. It reminds me of the People's Choice trophy. If you've seen that.
I like the idea of your professor being like, "We're going to nominate you for the the Tennessee Hall of Fame award. Not a big deal. Just, like."
Yeah.
And if we could get started here, first question we wanted to ask you is, why did you gravitate towards poetry specifically? Is there something inherent in this medium that you think is maybe more powerful than others?
I've been asked this question or a version of this question a million times.
Mhm.
And I have the same answer, but I hate giving the same response the same way. So I always try to come up with some nuanced way of, saying the same thing I've always said. You don't know that I've said it, but I do. You know what I mean?
Right. Yes, sir.
But so I guess I'll just stick with, I don't know how the sensibility, how rhythm came to mean a lot to me. I think that was my intro into poetry. I was very in tune with how the sentence worked at a very young age, in a way that I haven't really thought about it. I always seem to give kind of a cursory kind of explanation to this question. But if I think about it just a little bit more deeply, and briefly, I'd say I was really in tune with the way the syllables in the sentence created this, this rhythm, and a lyricism that I don't even think I came across it in a more obvious way, like say reading Faulkner or Toni Morrison or some of those, writers who are very lyrical. I don't know. I just tended to gravitate towards that. So when I got to college, particularly when I transferred from Tennessee State University to the University of Tennessee, I took a course in creative writing, introductory course. And we did just poetry and nonfiction. And we started with poetry and fiction. We started with fiction first. And after that, my instructor wanted to know about my poetry because she was really excited to read it. And I'm like, I don't write poetry. You know, I had never really seriously written poetry. She just assumed I did because of the language in my prose. So that's kind of how I came into poetry, is by like, oh, well, if you really liked my, the fiction, which it's like, when I think about it now, it's like, well, there's, maybe my fiction wasn't as successful as I would like to, have been, since that's all she could really concentrate on was, the lyricism, of it, and that reminded her of, poetry. So I felt like, well, I needed to prove something. So I just, really studied, the way the poets that we were being introduced to. I really, especially like Lucille Clifton, there was a time where I was writing a lot of my, poems all in lowercase. And I was kind of almost fraudulently becoming a poet. I was just mimicking a lot of things that, I was reading, and not really trying to develop my voice as a poet. But I guess I was a successful mimic because it led to a lot of, success. I won some prizes and, some money.
Yeah.
Got into the Mishner Center.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's basically, kind of a long-winded way of saying that's how I got into poetry. But I don't know if it's as fortuitous as that it might, seem. It has very humble beginnings, I guess.
I think it's very interesting what you said about like mimicking as opposed to finding your voice. Cause at least, I mean, I'm still in college. I'm not, as far along as, but I often find that like mimicking someone is sort of the first stage of like developing your own voice. Because I mean, obviously, I guess you're taking influence from the people that you read and that you're especially fond of, and that like, I don't know, that gives you like a baseline to build your own voice on. But I'm assuming this led to you pursuing your MFA. Like, can you give us a little bit about that process and what led you to do that?
Yeah, I want to back up just a minute just to comment on what you said about, because you're right, but mimicking, helping one to find their voice, if you understand that that's what the mimicking is supposed to do. That's something I didn't quite get. And I'm loath to critique my instructor. She was really wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I wouldn't be where I am today had she not encouraged me. But the assignment that she gave us to actually mimic, writers, I felt like the way she framed her response to that assignment made it seem like I had failed the assignment, because she could tell that I was the one who wrote whatever it was which is the assignment, right? That my voice was coming through and not the person who I was supposed to be mimicking. But this was an introductory course in creative writing for me. I had no prior training. So, and I'm a college student, and like most college students, like we're like, do the assignment, and I didn't do the assignment according to her response. And so I felt a certain kind of way about that. And years later, when I became, a teacher myself, I understood that I didn't fail the assignment but I didn't quite, get as much out of it because I didn't realize that the whole point of the assignment is to know when your voice is taken over. When you're, because you feel a resistance. And I know
Right.
that I know this very, intuitively now. When and I think a lot of writers do, we'll be reading, for instance, and we have to put it down to start writing. But we still have that author's voice in our heads, right? But once we start writing, because we're so inspired, our own voice will kick in. We might even try to do the same thing that we had just been reading, but when you know your voice, you start to feel a resistance to what you've been reading because it's not you. And
Mm.
then your voice can take over. And that's something that it took a while for me to learn, and to understand, like, this is, you can feel it. It's almost like, I don't drive, so I can only give you, this analogy based on what I've understood. But like when you're driving a stick shift, like you can feel when the gears are shifting. And so that's something that's very important, to understand. So I mean, I think it probably took me getting into the MFA program, which is, you know, something I didn't think I would, I'd be doing, coming out of, I didn't know what I was going to do coming out of undergraduate, but this same instructor told me about the Missioner Center. And it was like, oh, wow, there's, this free money, you don't have to teach or do anything. But I was all set on going to New York. I wanted to go to NYU and study with Sharon Olds and, Gally Cannell, who's actually retiring, the year I would have started. I got into NYU. They actually called me, um, to let me know, I'd gotten in, but they weren't offering me enough money to be able to live in New York. And at the time, I didn't realize New York isn't really a place if you don't have money. New
Mm.
York is not the place to go to get an MFA or any kind of, you know, postgraduate degree. You can go there afterwards, but I don't recommend, if you don't have the means to do so. But that's just me. But getting into the Missioner Center was lovely. And it was, I'm trying to remember the rest of your question, make sure I'm on the right.
Right. It was just about your MFA process. And yeah, I always find it an interesting field to navigate where the practical meets with the aspirational. What you said about not having enough, like New York City is not really the place you go without money. Like that's a tough area to navigate because you want to follow your dreams, you want to do what you want. And I guess that kind of goes hand in hand with our next question about, like, do you have any advice for fellow postgraduates on that same journey or a similar one?
And I did say postgraduate, and that means something different when you're actually in graduate school.
Okay.
It's it could mean postdoctoral or something like that. So I mean, I do mean, after you finish undergraduate
Right, right.
and you're going into like a graduate program. Um, yeah, I would say one of my professors refused to write me a letter of recommendation unless I published first. Now, granted, I don't think she was serious. I think she still would have written it. I think she just wanted me to try. It was one of those things where they're teaching you to do things without you realizing that's what they're doing.
Mhm.
So it's easy to take it like very literally and be like, oh my God, if I don't, publish something, then I'm going to miss out on this wonderful opportunity to not just get the letter of recommendation, but the letter of recommendation that can actually get me into some of these schools. But she was basically saying, I had the talent to publish. And she was giving me that encouragement to do that. But I will say this, you do not have to be published to go into an MFA program in creative writing.
Thank God.
There's several of my cohort members at the Mission Center who had not published a single thing when they enrolled. As a matter of fact, sometimes it could be to your detriment to be published going into an MFA program. I was on the admissions committee for one cycle at the nonfiction writing program. It was the year that I got the a postgraduate fellowship. It's the Provost postgraduate fellowship in nonfiction. So I was like a visiting assistant professor. And so they, asked me to join the committee, and we got several wonderful applicants, but it was obvious that some folks were way too qualified, as it were. They had books published with some of the major, New York presses, some of those major imprints. And it was during COVID as well. So it was obvious that some of them were like, there's no jobs, so I'm going to apply to the nonfiction writing program so I can at least get 3 years of, funding while I figure things out. A lot of that was going on. But it didn't help, some of their causes when it's like, how can we help you at all? Like, you've published extensively with, and not just extensively, but with major presses. You've published in some of the major journals, and the MFA programs are for students who have the potential to get to that place, not for those who are already there.
Yeah.
What can the program do for you? And what can you contribute to the program? Someone who doesn't seem to have a need for the program can be a scary, undertaking. And when you think about the kind of person that you might have to deal with, and that's not always the case either. Some of them who really do need the help, they don't realize that they do. Sometimes if you get into some of these prestigious programs, there is at once a sense of imposter syndrome, but on the other side of the coin, it's like, I'm a badass, So they're not incompatible, and both of them can get on your nerves, right? For someone to constantly, question like their worth in a program, but then turn around the next day and you can't tell them anything about.
So it's definitely like managing an ego type thing.
Oh God, yes. It is. It's a terrible thing.
So I lost my page. Oh yeah. So for your novel or your collection of poems, Intimacies and Borrowed Light, if I get it there we go. It's obviously dealing with a lot of things about trauma and sexuality and, substance abuse too. How did you navigate this sort of process in the middle of writing this? And how did it affect your mental health? And were you able to take care of yourself?
That's such a good question, because the implication is that, that book was written like from beginning to end, deliberately, the way we think about the way one may say write a novel or a memoir. But it wasn't that at all. As a matter of fact, that book is only in existence because of a good friend of mine, Dr. Jesse Graves, who had been teaching. I had 3 chapbooks already. So you mentioned The Ghost Tonight Becomes, but I published 2 previous to that. What are they? The Terribly Beautiful, which was the first one, and Sotto Voce is the second one, then The Ghost Tonight Becomes. Jesse had been teaching those first 2 especially, and they eventually he wasn't able to get them. They were out of print. So he basically wanted to get those chapbooks back into print. And he found the wonderful folks at Eastover Press, Jen Loving being among them, the poetry editor. And, you know, based off just his good word, they offered me a contract. And so we went to work on it, but I didn't want to just put together a book that was just those 3 chapbooks together, because some of those poems from those chapbooks didn't age well at all. So they were not invited to the party. And so it was a process. You know, there were poems that were 20 years old, you know, that are in this book. So it was more so a literal like collecting the poems as opposed to actually having to write into it. I don't think I wrote anything new for this book. There were certainly poems that had not been collected in any of the chapbooks, or, you know, or even in some journals. But yeah, I don't think I wrote anything new. So I guess the answer to like how I, you know, dealt with like the trauma in general, though, it was, you know, ironically, or maybe not so much, a lot of the, particularly like with the substance abuse, I was abusing substances while I was writing those poems. So I didn't quite feel, you know, traumatized, you know, by much of what I was writing about. Even when I got sober, and, you know, a poem like Delirium Tremens is a poem that I wrote when I was sober. What it gave me an opportunity to do was to feel like I wasn't just, you know, for much of my career as a poet, you know, I'm writing as a free verse poet, and I'm just kind of writing whatever I'm feeling. But once I got sober, I actually started playing around with form a lot more. So I had always been, you know, I mentioned earlier about, you know, the syllables, you know, that I was, you know, impressed by in those really beautiful sentences that I was reading when I was younger, that, you know, kind of encouraged my style. Well, I decided to be more deliberate about, you know, syllables in my own poetry. So I started writing in syllabics. And I wrote several. And that was really, you know, wonderful for me to have that constraint to work within. So I think, you know, as you know, when it comes to like the book as a whole, I take that back. I said that I didn't write anything new. That's a lie. I wrote those, I wrote a couple of the what are they called? HIV blues poems. Now, granted, the reason why I say that I didn't write anything new is because even those were revisions of poems that had failed, but they were so radically revised. I feel like they were new, you know, for all intents and purposes. So those were kind of the only a few. There may be a couple more that were failed poems that had been in some folder for years that I ended up reworking completely anew. So I guess, you know, I think that should count towards writing, you know, because it was a sense of kind of, you know, providing some connective tissue between sections, you know, and of course, the structure of the book is something that is, I think, part of the writing process that doesn't just happen. You have to, you know, be deliberate in that. So, yeah, but you know, it was a really wonderful experience. You know, I don't think that I was triggered as
I
much as
think,
some of the stuff that I'm writing now has surprisingly been triggering.
well, I think
Um,
it's really interesting what you said about being in the middle of the substance abuse and all that, about you don't feel really traumatized when you're, in the process of abusing stuff like that. And it kind of makes me wonder how trauma changes the farther away we move from it, because something that it didn't even click with me until you said it, but something I really like about Intimacies and Borrowed Light is that it feels like you're in the middle of it, which is, it's a unique place to inhabit as both, I imagine, as both a narrator and as a reader.
yeah,
Something else I noticed about the novel is that sorry, I keep calling it a novel, the collection, is that it deals heavily with like the crossover of the sexual and the sensual. Like
Mhm.
it's there. I think there's distinctive differences between those two terms, because one's purely sexual and the other's purely sensual. Can you talk a little bit about what the process was like with exploring the boundaries of that? Like, were there any distinct differences or things like that?
yeah. Hmm. Yeah, that is a good question because they are different for sure. And I think the sensual for me provides texture for the sexual. I think the sexual kind of exists. It's something that you can just say, um, or just put it in a context, two people of the same gender who are engaged in a sexual act is just stating, a sexual kind of, existence, but it's how they're engaging in it that provides like the texture, the sensuality. And the sensuality isn't necessarily always tethered to the sexual. I think there can be something sensual about, I think there's, the poem that I wrote about my father and I having, this shared vice. I think that's a word that you would use in the correspondence.
Mhm.
In our alcoholism, the way I'm describing, this night that, he's where he is in his apartment and I'm where I am living with my mother,
Mhm.
you know, and, the way that I'm describing the night, I felt there was something very sensual about that isn't sexual,
Mhm.
right? But there was something that I felt that was very attuned to not just nature in the sense of, you know, the physical, nature, like the moon and stars and, the trees and all that, but how we inhabit it, like the natural implications that is even in addiction. Like, I realize during, particularly as I was working on the memoir, that I mean, I knew that alcoholism ran in the family. My father eventually died
Mhm.
from, just last year, which is something we knew would happen if he didn't quit. And it was certainly a path I was on my way, since I was on my way, I was on that path. When I got, diagnosed with congestive heart failure and all that stuff in 2015. But there was something that's natural about all of that, the pre-genetic or the genetic predisposition to alcoholism is natural, right? And so like how can those, occurrences, provide substance for the written, word. So yeah, to go back to like the sexual and sensual, on one hand, yeah, I am my next book, not the memoir necessarily, because although it does deal with sex positivity, but the one I'm currently working on which is also my dissertation, is definitely more sex positive. And I'm really having, you know, because when you say sex sensual, there's also the implication of literariness.
Mhm.
So that's something that I'm kind of rubbing up against, not no pun intended there, but I'm kind of struggling with how the sensual can be so erotically charged that it kind of breaches the boundaries between what is considered literary and what is considered just, obscene. I've been reading a lot of, precursors like, Vitali or Nicholson Baker. There are lots of, members of writers of the new narrative movement, Robert Gluck, for instance, Kathy Ecker. So there's a way in which, right now I'm really negotiating how the sensuality as it's tethered to the sexual, as I've been writing, throughout my entire career, how it's entering, less stable waters, as as it were. So I'm glad that that you picked up on it in Intimacies and Bar, like, because it is something that has always been a preoccupation. I think the sensual also is tethered to this, notion of, yearning and desire, longing. I think that was something that I think is really present, not in just that book, Intimacies and Bar Light, but in a lot of my writing in general.
I think what really struck me out about like the sensual in this is that it creates a sort of interesting tension, because obviously with the heavy subject matter, there's a lot of gravity to what's happening, but it always feels delicate in the way it's portrayed, and it just creates an interesting tension there to inhabit as a reader.
Mhm.
Um, Something else that definitely struck me out was you have these illustrations.
Yes.
Can you tell us what that was like, working with an artist who interpreted what was in your work? And
Yeah, so Annie Fletcher is the artist, and Shelley Obar, her partner, she's the one who designed the cover. Which
phenomenal cover too, just absolutely like, yeah.
Yeah. I sent just to briefly mention Shelley. I had, she and Annie and I have been partnering for a while. Actually, the Ghost Tonight Becomes actually features a cover um uh of Annie's of the illustration that Annie drew, which is actually the illustration for the poem self-portrait the self-portrait in third person. It's about the cow head and the male body and the pasture. Um, but real quick, Shelley, just asked me to, send her some materials as an idea for what I wanted. And at the end of the day, I went through several like landscapes, landscapes, that, but then I realized I kind of wanted it to be a human kind of representation. So I came up with I found some, photos online that I was able to get. I didn't even necessarily need permission. They were free to use. So Lord, I'm blanking on the photographer's name because I don't talk about him often, but he's credited. Um, but anyway, going back to the illustrations, that Annie and I want to say maybe it was in 2013 thereabouts. I had approached her about doing, a kind of an ekphrastic I guess in a reverse ekphrasis, because the ekphrasis is usually the poem is in response to the art. Well, this time the art was in response to the poem. And Annie was working with Shelley, because Shelley's, writes poetry as well as being a digital and visual artist and photographer. They worked together to kind of interpret some of the poems, and I just let it happen. I didn't do anything. It was just like, here, do you want to do this? She's like, yeah. And, and we did it. Unfortunately, we didn't get the opportunity to publish that specific project. But when I won the Chatbook Prize for The Ghost Night Becomes, I was able to use 2 of the illustrations for the front and back covers. Then when I got the contract with Eastover, I almost missed the opportunity because I hadn't even thought about putting those in because it had been so long. But at some point when it was well into the project, I emailed Denton and asked if it was possible to include the illustrations. And he was like, yeah, basically it was just a matter of the reproductive quality, how they would look. Now, that's when things really kind of put not necessarily a hiccup in the structure of the book, but you can imagine that, I had already had all the poems in order in the way that I envisioned it. Now all of a sudden we're adding these illustrations. Well, they have to go next to the poems that they're representing. And that, unfortunately, that didn't create like this kind of equitable distribution of illustration. So there were like areas where it's like all of these, illustrations, but then there's none here. So I had to reorder the book so that each section pretty much had about the same number of illustrations so that it felt more cohesive. So that was a pain in the what, because that took some kind of artful, like, you really don't, particularly like a certain poem, like you don't really belong in this section, but you have to go here because we need, we need this illustration, here, or, so that was, it was fun, but it also created kind of a pain in the, experience for me.
I think that's an interesting thing too, because you don't really, I had no idea about any of that. You don't really think about that. I think as a reader is something, when you're reading like just your plain old fiction novel or something, it's just sort of words of the page. But the moment you introduce illustrations, you now have like the aesthetic of how it looks. You have to think about the positioning of the image and what it does for the actual poem. So that's really interesting. Now, I'd like to go into some poems that really stuck out to me and affected me personally, if you don't mind. And I'd like to start with, is it Picaresque? Is that how you say it? Picaresque? I'm sorry? Picaresque. Yeah. There is a line, or a few lines actually, that really, if you'll allow me to read, where was it? Okay, sorry.
And Jamie, feel free to jump in with any questions.
I am just enjoying listening to you talk about it because it's yeah.
That's why I saw a look on your face like a few minutes ago, like you wanted to respond.
There's a couple. Well, I actually had the privilege of having one of my poems interpreted by a painter,
Oh,
and standing in front of it, like I was just going to ask you what that, because the feeling that I had standing in front of a visual representation and somebody else's interpretation, you know, it was quite overwhelming for me.
yeah. I was just blown away at how surreal they all came out. Like every single one, I believe, was just surreal. And that's not necessarily Annie's aesthetic, that to my knowledge. I could be wrong. At least at that time. But there was just, it was really interesting. Um, that like in the picaresque poem, like you know, there's a line about you know, what is it, 1,000 wings, some insect or something being trapped in a jar, and that's what she does this thing. Yeah, it's those are wasps, and you know, it's like it was incredible. Like that's, you know, that's where she went, and I mean it tells its own narrative. You know, I don't consider it like necessarily even a counter narrative necessarily to the poems, but a parallel. You know, I was amazed, honestly. It was, and honored that, you know, she took, you know, these poems so seriously,
Mm.
you know, to be able to create that kind of work. It was quite astonishing.
Yeah, you can definitely tell because it's just like you said, the surreal aspect of it is really, really incredible. The quote that really struck me the most from this one is goes as follows: their bodies swayed, one hand gripping netless hoops, ripened in twilight as though any moment they tattoo themselves to night's papyrus. Surely this was girlhood whimsy. Each night, sinking my head into the cold pillow cushion, dreaming of asses barely contained in jeans they pulled up, sporadically as if to showcase the bulbous curves with no more shame than women on my walls, cocking enough leg to send any other boy into a frenzy. But my glee manifested in those sweat-grimed boys scaling fences erected like prison bars around the neighborhood while cops chased them into a chokehold. I'd watch just as any nosy neighbor too bored with their own life to pay attention to it. How they writhed beneath grips as they'd done 1,000 times before, wrestling with other boys, almost like a rite of passage in case one day they too have to fight themselves out of juvenile hall or worse, prison. That is a very powerful sequence of like stanzas, and because it's sort of it's the narrator's budding sexuality that is in conversation with the violence of the criminal justice system. Can you give us a bit of a background about how this impacted you, especially as a queer Black author?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I guess the only way I can answer that is to kind of think about, because you know, hearing that, you know, and I will say this, you know, the just I have a lot of side notes, so as we talk, so bear with me. You know, be
We
not afraid of my
appreciate your rabbit trails.
yeah,
I'm
Absolutely.
kidding.
It's so interesting.
Feel
so
free.
yeah, so Be Not Afraid of My Body is a lyrical memoir um that actually makes use of many of the poems in Intimacies and Borrowed Light. And it was always intended that way, which is interesting because, you know, when Intimacies and Borrowed Light was published, just like, oh hell, now it's going to seem like, you know, there's just double dipping that's happening because these things are going to be recurring in these two different books. And that wasn't the intention. But then I got over that and I was like, but I'm doing something completely different. They're completely you know, contextualized. I actually add a lot more to what you just read in a way that it would not have worked. It works better in the kind of lyrical prose as opposed to this poetic stanzas, you know, that you read. But I think in each case, there's this, you know, and I just not even just that case, but just like in general, the way that I write, because I like to begin one place and then end in a completely different place and be like, wait, how do we get here? Like, and I'm not really circling back to where we started, right? And that's intentional because there's something about, in this instance, the speaker is enamored of these boys that he's seeing on the basketball court. And I think to enact that sensibility, then the thoughts need to carry through. Meaning the speaker needs to be thinking about them and foregrounding them so that the speaker kind of disappears a little bit. So we should always be thinking that, when the speaker is lying his head down on the pillow to dream about these boys, this is what he's dreaming about without saying that he's dreaming about them. And they kind of, in the foregrounding, I think creates a kind of powerful narrative, because it creates kind of a milieu about what it is like to be queer and Black growing up in the projects, but also to be any of these boys who are growing up in the projects. It's all part of the same environment. So I'm trying to evoke that sense without providing connective tissue, without saying, look here, reader, this is what I'm trying to do. It may seem tangential, but it's not. It's all connected. It's following a kind of stream of consciousness that isn't as arbitrarily rendered as some stream of consciousness might be. Some stream of consciousness doesn't really make sense, or it seems like you read some Faulkner, when he gets going, it's like, what the hell are you talking about? And I want to tone that way down, like in the sense, in an instance like this, to be like, no, it's all part of the same narrative. And that's something, that just happens quite naturally. I mean, that's, when I talked earlier about finding your voice, that it never dawned on me not to pause and reorient the reader as to like, how this special attention that we're now paying to these boys has anything to do with the speaker's, first utterances about his attraction to them. Like the attraction isn't gone. The longing for them has never left. It's just being more, complicated, for lack of a better word. So yeah, it just felt like it was time for them to kind of take over the poem. That was just, and I think that just goes back to what my voice is telling me.
Yeah.
To do.
And this poem, like its subject matter is very sort of evocative of also self-portrait on a Key West auction block. And the subject matter in that, because what really stood out to me is you write this in a way where it sort of seems like shame almost precedes questions of sexuality. If I can read this reference quote, those boys are what I once was, curious, afraid, dance with lesbians because it's safe, hide in shadows, witnessing pockets of men gyrating against another, wrapped in indigo glow. They hate this song or love it in private and question what goes on behind curtains or in the farthest rooms marked off with velvet ropes. Just absolutely beautiful way of structuring that. And it really made me question, like, well, how does shame precede these questions of sexuality?
Well, in this sense, like in that poem, there's a lot of projection that's happening. So I think, one way that I was thinking about that poem, it's not just like, giving a kind of an actual account of, this experience that I had on a spring break trip to Key West. Incidentally, this was while I was there, I found out that I had gotten into the Missioner Center and some other writing programs. So it was a very celebratory, week,
Eventful, very eventful.
very eventful. Yes.
And Key
But
West, so yay.
and Key West, yes. But thinking about the self-portrait, which is interesting that it's self-portrait. When the speaker is so obviously like the subject of the poem, in a way that self-portrait almost seems tautological or or redundant to call it that. But it's called that because it's not really about the speaker, it's about the speaker. First of all, like, this is some bullshit that I'm on this auction block, and I'm in, in the South, Key West, though it may be, but it's the South. So there's a lot of implications there. But then there's just, I think my editor had when I rendered this moment in the memoir, especially the moment about when he directs his attention to those boys, he wants that took him out. And he wanted to know why. So I think your question about shame preceding sexuality, I think it's tied up in my editor's kind of confusion about what is happening here. And the thing is, it's like the speaker's experience as a queer individual precedes, especially, well, I should say, the speaker's, assuming that these boys that he's witnessing will one day recognize, they are not straight, let's just say that, and come to terms with it in a similar way that the speaker has come to terms as much as he has with his own sexuality. So his experience before them is kind of, preceding what he assumes is going to be theirs. At some point. And I don't want to do too much, analysis of the poem, because it's complicated to situate, the slave image with, the image of being in the closet. Right. And how shame is, present in both of those instances, and what does, a system of racial terror against, Black people, how is that connected to, a sense, ostensibly, aberrant sexuality? Like how is all that fitting together in a way that isn't really unpacking all of that at all?
It was it was a very interesting like narrative to come across, because it's well, like you said, not to analyze it too much, but there's also the objectification of the narrator, who is a Black man too. You have the line that's I'm their man to go there, I've never been with a Black man, and their anxious faces flush with expectation break into grins as though wondering, is it true what they say? And it's dealing with a lot, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. It's like,
that's a good point. Yeah, there's a fetishization of the Black, masculine body, that is, on display, that's on the auction block. While, and ironically, that's the same Black masculine body that has also been the source or the precipitator for the racialized terror, particularly against Black men, historically. And then, then there's that the kind of perspective, pan to those boys in the corner who are, suffering from some kind of, internalized shame. I mean, they're in the gay bar. So, I mean, that just putting them there is, enough for, at least for me to say, I mean, come on, something's up here. Even if, and and it goes on, it speculates about how, yeah, they'll pick the most masculine person to take home, but it won't be anything spectacular, the sex that they have, and all of that. So it's all about spectacle. It's all about, illusions, and it's about the kind of gaze that upon bodies, and the kind of, inferences that we make about, certain bodies. That is, I think, what the poem is really trying to address in, this really compact, way. Like, if you read the poem is a prose poem, actually. It's, I did everything but, full justify the thing, so that it's like this. I didn't want to go that far. I think that would have been too much to actually make it this block of text. But it's blocky enough to where there's still like the right side that's got its jagged edges. That, for me, the whole shape of the poem is symbolic of kind of the futility in trying to really feel like there's any kind of definitive way to interpret the poem. Not to say that that's the case, that can be done for anyone's poems or anyone's written work, but particularly this poem. Like, I wanted it to be, you're in this gay club, there's, all this nightlife happening, and there's so much to be unpacked. And here are kind of like the superficial kind of avatars for all of these different, ideas that can be, taken away from when you witness a scene like this. And, that was basically, I think that's where the self-portrait kind of comes in, because there's kind of almost a flattening of that moment. When I think about it in terms of a piece of art, like it isn't necessarily three-dimensional, but it can be.
It's also incredibly interesting to me because it's like a cascade of influences on this particular moment. Like you said, being there, observing the moment happening in real time. It also reminds me of that cascade of influence on inheritance, where, if I can read this line, it says, "Like squawking birds or turf wars among alley cats, this language fogs the mirrors we stare into when we realize our unmistakable likeness, down to the muddied, red-rimmed eyes trapped in our faces." And it's this moment of, I mean, it's the narrator's relationship with his father, and it's this moment where their relationship is recognized through the lens of this mutual vice they share, this sort of influence that they're both having to contend with. Can you speak about like what that's like as a writer, charting that relationship and exploring the
Yeah,
implication of that?
it was easy. Actually, my my daddy was always,
Not my animals.
yeah, no, you're fine. I'm
Thank
watching
you
them.
so much.
I'm watching the cat, and I'm just thinking, yeah, I love it. With my dad, when he was, living in the projects after he and my mom separated and divorced, and his life became what it was. But I used to visit him, and we used to drink. And after my first two books came out, he would always, I gave him copies, and he'd share them with his friends. But then that's when he started to overshare with me. And he'd always say, "Now put that in your book." And I'm just like, because I wrote a lot, I've always written about him. And I'm like, I'm not, it's like, write your own damn book. I'm not writing, this, when I write about you, I'm writing about me, you know. It isn't about you. Sharon Odes wrote a whole book called The Father, which is a wonderful, wonderful collection if anyone hasn't read it. And it is about the father, but it's about a daughter witnessing her father's dying, so it's about her every bit as much it is about him. And if anything, because it's so, it's collected around how this narrator is responding to his dying. It becomes more and more about the speaker than it is about the actual subject of the book. And that's the same thing I want my daddy to understand. It's like, you saying put this in your book. It's like, well, I will if it feels relevant to my experience that I'm writing about. Yeah, I'm not writing a biography. That's something completely different. And even then, that's such a subjective, way of writing, that it's about the author as much as it is about its subject. So writing a poem like, Inheritance is, it was not, I keep wanting to say fun, but it just seems permissible. That's a whole different kind of way of looking at it. I don't feel like he's going to object. Not the way my mother was so embarrassed when, she read the poem Self-Portrait at 8, which is a poem, it may be 8 lines long, about, the speaker witnessing, his parents' naked bodies, naked bodies in bed the next morning after they've obviously had sex. Now, that was definitely written during a time when I was drinking, and all of that, because I don't think that could be a poem I could write sober,
Yeah.
especially describing my mother's nipples. That was, and of course, that was definitely written at a time when I was reading, Sharon Odes quite a bit, and she's, writing about the Pope's penis and writing about masturbating after, nursing her infant daughter, so she gave all kinds of permission to be sensual and sexual, even in the most tense, circumstances. So yeah, writing poems like that, was permissible. I feel like it was okay.
Yeah.
I could be truthful as much as, and by that I mean, I felt like I could just say, even though, the language is already couching so much of the sentiment, because you're having to evoke through, devices, imagery and metaphors and symbols and things of that nature, because it's artifice, for all intents and purposes. You're saying something very simply, or something that could be very simply said, but you're saying it in a way that's trying to elevate it into something completely different.
Hmm.
So, but at the same time, I felt like I could be less, I could obscure, that sentiment a little less than I would have, some poems where it's like, it's so symbolic that it's entirely representational rather than, being the literal thing.
Yeah.
That
I
is-
think, oh, sorry.
No, good, yeah.
I think it's interesting what you say about like how you're saying something is sort of impactful to what you're saying. Because especially one of those examples that really stuck out to me was the next poem, which is "My Father Walks in Rain with no umbrella" on page 55, because there's this one line to me that is very interesting because it's about the implication of the image. Let me go back to it. Okay. Yeah, so it says, I just lost my page. I'm sorry.
I've done that.
Yeah.
times.
So my father walks in rain with no umbrella from his apartment in the projects to the liquor store a few blocks away, deeper in the projects. And it's sort of immediately the reader has this idea of the geography and the placement of the liquor store, which is in the projects, but then deeper in the projects, really emphasizes, to me at least, really emphasizes a sort of like stronger underlying current, or maybe a message to that. Can you speak a little bit about how geography sort of helps shape the implication of an image?
Okay, so this is a question where, I have to reveal my hand a bit, or reveal. It's like you've hit on, like, oh, you found me out. Because to be literal, like, if I'm thinking about where my father is living at the time, that I'm, the place where that takes place in the poem, like the liquor store is technically not in the ghetto. It would take way too, it's close by. It's walking distance, the way that most things can be walking distance, but preferably you'd rather not have to walk to get there. But that seems irrelevant, and also not right to give the actual location of the liquor store, because that would have been too much to give directions. Go down the street, make a left, and then all that. No. But then there was something symbolic in the sense that in all likelihood, he didn't always have to go to the liquor store, but there was a kind of bootlegging that was taking place in the project. So in a sense, the liquor store could be his next door neighbor who sells liquor out of his apartment. So, that could be the liquor store. So that, so on the one hand, I'm kind of using the liquor store as a literal, image to make a point, but it's also, being symbolized as well, because it isn't, because I'm not talking about the literal liquor store, because to talk about the literal liquor store would mean I would have to write the poem in a different way. And it's, and this is, part of what happens in creative nonfiction too. Like, the facts are not necessarily what's important. It's the truth that is trying to be arrived at that's important. Now, there are people who, when it comes to creative nonfiction, like, there's no such thing as creative nonfiction. There can't be nonfiction that is creative, because then it's not being truthful, because it's not beholding to facts. So the same applies, to lots of writing that is potentially nonfictional, like poetry can be. So I wasn't concerned about, in the back of my head, it's like, yeah, that line about what, being in the projects and deeper in the projects. I think the deeper to me was giving me license for the kind of the proximity from the father to the liquor store being so vast. And then I guess, just not to hammer the point too much, but I'm talking about craft issues right now, about thinking about what may be your preoccupation as a writer when you're writing. So just to get back to, something a little less didactic, hopefully. Yeah, just that moment was just really important to think about the readers, envisioning this father who is walking, in this type of weather to get to, a source of all kinds of things. It's not just satiating a vice, it's also something that he needs, to survive, ironically. Alcoholism is one of the very few, I shouldn't say very few, I'm not sure about that, but it is definitely one of infliction, or I'm sorry, affliction that one needs help to quit. You will die if you try. You can die if you just quit cold turkey. And my father suffered many seizures, not because he tried to quit, but because his BAC, his blood alcohol content, probably got so low that his body started to respond, which is what happened to me, actually. So there's lots that's that I'm trying to get at there, and hoping that at least a certain kind of reader will understand what it is I'm trying, to get at.
Yeah. I think especially with, we're talking about sort of the craft with this one, because I think the craft here is really, especially what draws my attention, because there's another quote related to this one where it's, quote, "The cultural milieu of the projects has shifted over the years since he became the man haggard in clothes, clinging wet to his frail frame. How so much idle time and fifths of kamkacha have rendered his skin and bones to skin and bones." And it's this repetition of skin and bones to skin and bones that really, well, I mean, it drives home the point, but it also, it's sort of similar to how, like, deeper in the projects, it really underscores the craftsmanship on display here and the strength of an image in that way.
Yeah, that's anytime I think about craft, a lot of times I'm thinking about, like, what are some of the deliberate choices that I make, or that one makes, like the intentionality that, can seem not necessarily obvious, in a pejorative sense, but something that one can sit with and hopefully be in, impressed upon, to think, about what this means. And I definitely was getting at the colloquialism of skin and bones, and putting against, like, the literal, one's literal skin and bones. So what do we mean when we say someone is nothing but skin and bones, right? And getting to the sense that, the first iteration of skin and bones is to suggest, a person who may have been, who was healthy, who was healthy, who's, you could determine, that they had skin and bones, but you didn't necessarily see them, in the way that one does when, say, you're emaciated, when it becomes, a problem to be, referred to as skin and bones. Right. So I'm getting at this notion of a before and after, but using the same image in and thinking about the way it signifies, in language, both literally and symbolically. And is a really, and also, not just what we mean by skin and bones, like to refer to someone who may be unhealthy. But I was also thinking, there's a way in which one might think of skull and bones, which, tends to symbolize poison, and alcohol being a poison or can poison the body. So there's lots of ways in which, you know, using deliberately using, skin and bones in that way is hopefully going to do more work. Because it's the repetition is asking the reader to kind of, sit in this moment. It's a moment of excess, both in the language, but also in what it's referring to.
It's a very heavy image too. It just really popped out on the page to me. I know we can only keep you here till about 4:45, so I'm gonna go ahead and skip to a little bit for In Defense of the Closet, because this was another one that really moved me. You have this quote here who says, it's quote, "Who really needs to know the missing part of his story? What's there locked behind the eyes, cowering, the unsolvable riddle? Something grave peers, blank like slate or tombstone chipped away until only by some generous light what is spilled out is barely understood." And what really stands out to me about these few lines is the idea of this unsolvable riddle. Is this like, earlier we spoke about questions of shame preceding sexuality. I feel like this sort of goes hand in hand with the unsolvable riddle and everyone's recognition of their own. Can you speak a little bit about this, or how this process might have been unique to you?
Well, I don't think it was the poem itself, and especially that, those lines, as I'm really trying to get at the point. I think you picked out a really important part of the poem that is, I think, the whole reason why I wanted to write the poem. If I'm not mistaken, I think I wrote that around 2010, but it was around that time where the It Gets Better campaign started, because there were, this, string of, suicides, from that, that gay youth were committing because they just could not handle, being in a society that wouldn't allow them to be who they were. And so this notion of an unsolvable riddle is, again, trying to do a lot. It's unsolvable because, people don't know, that they're trying to understand, like, what someone's sexuality is so that they can do what with that. What is your purpose? They're trying to circumscribe some kind of an existence for this individual by trying to understand what their sexuality is. But then there's an unsolvable riddle that is, it doesn't exist, in the sense that, I'm writing about the down low right now. And I'm actually trying my best to be very professional in my response to a book, some claims made in a book that was published in 2005 called Beyond the Down Low by Keith Boykin, where he makes some claims about the down low being about cheating, and that if, Black men who were, cheating on their female partners on the down low, if they would just be honest with themselves about their sexuality and all this stuff. And I'm like, this is bullshit. Like, first of all, the down low isn't about cheating. You can be on the down low and not be a cheater. You don't have to be in a relationship. Then second of all, it's like, what do we mean by being true to one's sexuality? Sexuality is a social construct. So how is an individual supposed to be lying to themselves about their sexuality when it's something that somebody else has said, this is what sexuality is? You know, so it gets me really worked up. And it's something that's been, just kind of percolating in my mind for many years. In this sense, like when I wrote In Defense of the Closet, it is again one of those, instances where it's like this unsolvable riddle. Like, what is it that you're trying to solve exactly? And the riddle isn't necessarily the riddle of this person's sexuality, but of what in the hell is it that you're trying to do? That's the riddle for me. That when we're trying to determine who is gay, who is straight, that's the riddle that's unsolvable to me. The actual act of trying to define or forcing someone to define their sexuality so that I don't know what the answer to that is. So I'm trying to get at, on the one hand, I think the reader should understand that I'm talking about, because it's in Defense of the Closet, the riddle is, it's what is this individual sexuality? But then what is, when we think about what a riddle is, it is something that is often unsolvable, and it's intentionally, meant to, to be difficult to solve. And why is that? So hopefully, the poem ends, on the literal, sense of, letting a person come out on their own time, in their own time. It's a very kind of pedestrian sentiment, I'll admit. But I think, arriving there after presenting, that passage that you read, I think was important, for me to kind of structure, the poem in that way, so that hopefully that's the section that you read. That's what stands out.
I think, yeah, because I think what this poem's strength is utilizing something that I think has in the past been seen as a tool of oppression in a way. Like the closet itself it's almost like a tool of empowerment in this case, because, well, like you said, you need to let individuals come to terms with this on their own time. And I don't know, as someone, coming to terms with my own sexuality, that was a really strong line. And another strong line that I thought of was where you said, why into the eyes do we cast down our buckets? Why not into the hands which bear the markings of minimal labor, as if simply from a responsibility to rise from bed each morning? And that kind of seemed like you were sort of commentating on the under-recognized aspects of sexuality, which is not something that I think a lot of people really consider when they talk about sexuality. It's these aspects that we don't think about or that we don't know. Can you talk a little bit about how you apply a narrative to those aspects that may not be as culturally prominent?
Well, actually, that I'm actually referring to or alluding to Booker T. Washington. I don't know if this notion of cast down your buckets where you are. And when and I'm actually reading his book right now, Up From Slavery. Again, I've read it before. But what he's talking about by cast down your buckets, which I believe is actually, I want to say the notion is from the Bible. Don't quote me on that. I can't quite recall. But anyway, he's using this as a metaphor for and it was a very controversial, notion actually, of how to get, Black people post Reconstruction to, be able to coexist with white Southerners who were none too happy about, this free labor that they once had, being no longer available. And there was this, this not necessarily a need for a leader of the race, but there were many conflicting viewpoints about how the Black folks could prosper amongst so much white oppression and terrorism. So he's right, offering up this suggestion of being as one as a fist, but as separate as the fingers of the hand, right? So I'm kind of alluding to that, but it's ironic though, because this notion of minimal labor is not something that Booker T. Washington was indicating. He's talking about first of all, there was no minimal labor where Black folks were concerned, and in his metaphor, but the labor was very much industrial, agrarian. It was very much doing much with your hands. So what am I getting at, by using his metaphor in this way? Instead of looking into the eyes, like looking at the hands, like thinking about, I'm thinking about what a person has done. I guess in a sense, it's a way of making the argument of looking at the content of one's character, looking at the individual, and some of those, and I have to admit, using the Booker T. Washington, or alluding to that metaphor, isn't necessarily my way of invoking him as like central to this message, but certainly the ideas around the sentiment that he's trying to arrive at, using that metaphor, that's something that I think is important. Because I'm, and again, thinking about what it means to like look into one's eyes. When we think about the eyes being like the window to the soul and all that stuff, as if you can know a person, and looking at someone's hands which bears minimal labor may not mean that they have X labor. So there's so much that can be unpacked there. And again, it's going back to, because I remember when I wrote that, I kind of went with it because I hadn't fully worked out like how the connections were being made. They just kind of appeared to me, and I wrote it, and I said, but don't do anything more. Just leave it there, because I knew that I wasn't exactly invoking Washington, but I feel like to unpack that, to kind of it would have made it a completely different poem. And I feel like rather than me answer the question of like what's happening here, what might other readers think about it. So, I'm assuming you didn't catch the Washington reference.
No, honestly, that completely flew over my head. I'm pretty astounded by that I didn't get that, because I took a course on a survey of African American literature, and I just
No.
like,
It's, I
man,
mean, that's fine.
yeah,
That's fine because, it's, again, it's kind of, I don't want to use superficial because that never sounds right, even when the definition of it isn't as bad as everyone makes it out to be. But it wasn't necessarily meant to, to actually do a kind of deep dive
Mm.
into Washingtonian politics,
yeah,
racial politics. But certainly to think about what this this notion of a shared existence, this notion of, a harmonious, and not to sound, kind of Panglossian about, my expectations. Because, honestly, the question that's asked in the poem is rhetorical. And for me, it's almost, because I'm recalling writing, it's almost cynical. Because as the poet, as the writer of the poem, I don't fully believe that it's ever truly possible for that sentiment to actually be realized, just the way that when Booker T. Washington made that same speech at the Atlanta Exposition, like that, it didn't go over well for many people, especially many, folks like W.B. Du Bois, and his ilk. But anyway, that's a whole other.
it's very interesting how something that like can be so cynical is also interesting, like so inspirational in a way, because
Mhm.
it's, you're having to confront these two social constructions of sexuality in the closet, and
Yeah.
which are things that are imposed on people unwillingly. How you're able to take that and use it to your own advantage as an individual, that poem blew my mind. I think that one might be my favorite. I absolutely love that one.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely something that, and also in defense of the closet, I should say, is I had been reading a lot of Jack Gilbert
Mm.
as well. He's one of my favorites. And he has a beautiful poem called A Brief for the Defense that you have got to read. If you haven't read it, everybody go out and read that poem. It is absolutely
I'm gonna make a note of that real quick. What did you say it was? A brief for the defense?
for the defense. Yeah,
All
it
right.
is stunning, stunning poem.
All right. Well, Darius, thank you for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. Before you go, could you tell us a little bit more about your upcoming Be Not Afraid of My Body, a lyrical memoir?
Oh yes. That book. So essentially it's like, how do you talk about these things without giving too much away? Um so I wrote, the book as my master's thesis. When I yes, it is. Jamie, the tricky bitch. It is. And especially this one, because I can't, I say can't just because, and I don't mean like I'm incapable, but I'm intuitively writing linear narrative is very hard for me to sustain. Um, so many folks have, you know, many folks will, many folks have, you know, referred to the book as, you know, collection of essays. You know, by, you know, they'll just, you know, they'll refer to a piece as an essay, which they are essays. But they are individual pieces that are responding to, you know, what I was experiencing, you know, in 2015 when I was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. And, you know, I was in the hospital. They were trying to figure out, you know, because I was only 36 at the time. And the doctors, I had a whole team of doctors trying to figure out how, you know, because there was no family history of heart disease, any of that. So they were doing all this sleuthing, and they found out that I was HIV positive. Now, that wasn't necessarily what caused the congestive heart failure. They figured that my alcoholism is probably what led to that. But in the process, you know, they found out I was HIV positive. That's, you know, and I don't really talk. I don't know if I do or not, because I haven't read, because I'm thinking about when I mentioned what essays I'm mentioning the experience in, which is in a few, but there's one called piece called "You Don't Have to Like It," where I do. It's like the moment where the 2015 diagnoses are really, discussed. I remember my agent saying that needed to come as far into the book as possible, where I was content to have it be up front, because the book for me was not about that necessarily, but what's led, me to become this person who would become an alcoholic, who was diagnosed with congestive heart failure, who was, diagnosed with HIV. Like, what were the underlying, precipitators for that? But I do remember when I got the diagnosis for HIV, I just kind of laughed. Like, okay, but because for me, the congestive heart failure was the worst thing ever. Because HIV in 2015, I was about to say 2023, but still in 2023, but in 2015 still is treatable. So I wasn't really worried about that so much. Maybe the stigma that's attached to it, sure, but I wasn't like, oh my God, I'm gonna die. No, it was the congestive heart failure that was like, that was what really frightened me the most. So those are some of the kind of ironies too that I engage with in the book, like dealing with racism as a symptom of alcoholism. Like, how is that a symptom of alcoholism? Because it's about, this need to want to be liked by people, and, drinking alcohol, in a communal setting when you're not necessarily someone, especially when I began drinking, that's not what I did. I just did it because I just wanted to be cool, right? And then guess what happens? you know, and so it's like there's a lot of, interesting, links, connections that I'm trying to make throughout the book about, who this narrator is as a person that, allowed him to become, someone who had to deal with, this trauma, this like the kind of apex of trauma that happened in, 2015. It's dealing with a lot. There's sex. Apparently, this book is suitable for persons 22 years of age and up, according to, I forget if it was Target or some place where you can pre-order the book. like 22 is such a random number.
I know, like what?
I'm like, what the hell did I write? That you have to read the book. Actually, if I can. You have a ARC
Oh, that's a gorgeous cover.
of the book.
Mm,
Yeah. So
gorgeous cover.
nice little, this is through Belt Publishing. It's 260 pages long, which I was like, what? It's because it's just, this is because it's this size. Cause I was like, so you can my website is Darius, and so I guess I can put it in will putting in the chat even matter?
We will make sure that
We'll link it,
everybody
yeah.
and their mother knows how to get hold of everything that you've written,
Yeah.
because there's some absolutely exquisite images. I have heard a lot of your poetry when I met with Jacob, so I'm gonna have to get the book myself and the memoir.
Yes, it'll be out in February. It says February 6th of 2024. So yeah, I hope I answered. I know I was, I didn't give many details about the book, but it's a lyrical memoir in the sense that, I wrote these essays, and they have associative, connections, and it's frames using quotes from Essex Hemphill, who was a very early influence on my poetic practice. It's very, very, very influential, especially when it comes to sexuality and writing about sex too. So yeah, it's and so it is there's a lot of that sex and discussions of inherited vices, alcoholism, trying to snort cocaine through the lid end of a cigarette, those kinds of shenanigans.
No, that's why it's 22 and up.
Yeah. Austin, Texas, I'm telling you. Very, they're, some straightforward, like prosaic memoir-ish, writing. Then there's everything in between. So it is definitely stylistically, it is a very maneuvering kind of style. Like it just maneuvers through different types. Because I feel it's indicative of the space that this, the psychic space that the speaker is inhabiting, at any given time, and not just within a section, like there's not like they're grouped by style in sections. Like it is what it is.
Right.
Well,
but thank you.
Very proud of it.
Well, that'll be out February 6th, 2024.
Yeah.
Is it available for pre-order now?
It is.
Awesome.
Okay, awesome.
Yes. Please pre-order.
I know.
Pre-ordering.
Pre-ordering is so important for authors.
So important.
Important.
It is what helps, get the attention of other outlets who will put you on their most anticipated lists and all those types of things. I always wondered how you got on a list like that, without being famous already.
Yeah.
I don't know. Good luck. Somebody.
Yeah, that's the only thing I can think
Somebody
of.
knows somebody who knows them,
Yeah, I think a lot of it does happen, with the blurbs that you get, and people are like, oh, so-and-so blurbed this book, let me check it out, Then of course the pre-orders, because through pre-ordering that gets the word of mouth going.
Yeah.
I'm trying to do better with my social media presence, but I've got so many things to do that I feel like are more pressing than being on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter,
Hmm.
patrolling.
I just really want to be one of those old-fashioned reclusive writers who comes out with a book every 10 years and like grants one interview and then goes back into my cave to write some more. And why do I have to do everything now?
Yes, my last reading that I did, I basically said that thing. I said, I'm the kind of writer, I want to write something, publish it, give it to you, and go on about my business. I would love to do exactly that, Jake. Just write, publish something when I want to, do very minimal promotional.
Well, so that's I think the struggle now is how to be a writer and also a social media expert and a marketing expert, and you know, all of the hats that you now have to wear instead of just wearing the hat of writer.
Yeah, right. So that's unfortunately the world we live in.
It's true.
Yeah. But this has been wonderful. I really appreciate you all.
Thank you,
you.
Darius. Thank you so much for coming on.
Doing a interview via email at the same time. So it's, you know, at least this gets, you know, you get it taken care of.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I do have another appointment that I need to be on my way to, but thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Thank
Yes,
you
thank you,
so much.
Darius.
We really appreciate it.
Mhm.
Have a great weekend. Enjoy Iowa.
All right, I shall. I've been here 6 years, so.
Yeah.
Take care.
All right, bye-bye.